Thanks for joining us. We're going to start the webinar now.
Go ahead, Marcia.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Marcia Rubin. I'm a public participation supervisor based in the Chatsworth office for the Office of Environmental Equity at DTSC. I'd like to begin the meeting by acknowledging the following tribes on whose land I am today, include the Chumash, the Tongva, and the Kij. On behalf of the Department of Toxic Substances Control, thank you for joining us for our update on DTSC's settlement agreement with Boeing and the comprehensive framework resulting from mediation. We're here today to share some outcomes of our mediation with the Boeing company and how this agreement will strengthen the cleanup and get us to implementation more quickly. If you experience technical difficulties during the meeting, we ask that you sign in again using the link provided or call in at 669-900-6833. Webinar ID 846-7777-0106. Again, that's 669-900-6833. Webinar ID 846-7777-0106. Next slide, please. We want to start our meeting with a few agreements. By participating in the meeting tonight, you understand this meeting is being recorded. We know there's a lot of investment from community on this project, and we record our meetings in the spirit of transparency so that those who may not have been able to attend can stay informed. A lot of us are passionate about this project, and we hope to create a space where we can share this exciting news with you. Participants may be muted or escorted off the meeting if there's background noise, they take excessive time, or being discourteous with your fellow attendees or presenters. We'll respond to as many questions as we can, and we also have a lot of information on our website. We're happy to hear from you as well. Next slide, please. Our agenda for tonight includes a brief presentation providing an overview of the former Santa Susana Field Laboratory and highlights from the recently signed settlement agreement with the Boeing company. Most of our time tonight will be dedicated to a question and answer period focused on tonight's presentation. We'll conclude with a brief wrap-up. Next slide, please. Department of Toxic Substances Control is part of the California Environmental Protection Agency. We regulate the storage and handling of hazardous waste materials and oversee cleanup projects like this one at the Santa Susana Field Lab. The mission of DTSC is to protect California's people and environment from the harmful effects of toxic substances by restoring contaminated resources, enforcing hazardous waste laws, reducing hazardous waste generation, and encouraging the manufacture of chemically safer products. At this time, I'd like to welcome Jared Blumenfeld, the Secretary for Environmental Protection of the California Environmental Protection Agency. Next slide, please.
Hey, Marcia, I really appreciate the introduction and thanks to everyone joining this evening. Just for the record, I'm Jared Blumenfeld. I'm the Secretary of California's Environmental Protection Agency. And after months of negotiation, we have reached a comprehensive settlement framework with the Boeing company related to the cleanup of their area at the Santa Susana Field Lab. The framework has two parts, a settlement agreement between DTSC and Boeing, and a proposed MOU between the LA Water Board and Boeing. I'm proud of our team at both agencies for their tenacity, integrity, and commitment to getting this done. We're here tonight to discuss the settlement agreement between DTSC and Boeing. The LA Water Board will be holding a meeting next week on the proposed MOU. I know members of the LA Board are here on this Zoom, and I want to acknowledge them and thank them for their shared commitment to addressing this problem that has been generations in the making. No community should have to worry that their soil and water are contaminated with toxic chemicals and radioactive waste. Boeing, NASA, and the US Department of Energy are all now under binding agreements that compel a science-based, stringent cleanup of the soil and water at Santa Susana. The state of California is fully committed to holding all three responsible parties accountable for the cleanup. I promised the community that I would reestablish DTSC as a strong regulator, that I'd push DTSC to set high protective standards that the community deserves and has long advocated for. I promised this community that I'd push for implementation of the cleanup required under an order entered far too long ago in 2007. The settlement agreement does exactly that. It implements the risk-based cleanup called for in the 2007 order. Under the settlement agreement, DTSC sets the cleanup standard based on the best available science, because that is what regulators do. The 2007 order faced too many delays due to disputes with Boeing over the cleanup standards, and this agreement resolves those disputes and allows us to move forward with a comprehensive, stringent cleanup of the site. I'm proud of this agreement because it holds Boeing to account for the contamination in its area of responsibility. This agreement delivers the stringent cleanup the community has sought. This agreement secures Boeing's agreement to clean up radionuclides to background levels, meaning levels that existed locally before any industrial activity occurred. Boeing has never agreed to that thus far, and therefore it presents a remarkable victory. In connection with orders governing Department of Energy and NASA, it means that radionuclides will be cleaned up to background levels across the entire Santa Susana site. In terms of the chemical contamination, the community has long advocated for the resident with garden cleanup standard. This agreement secures Boeing agreement not to sue DTSC if it selects that standard. This means we can get to that stringent cleanup without the delays we have faced in the past. I trust this agreement because it's grounded in science. You'll hear a critique that DTSC has watered down the cleanup standard. That assertion is patently false and not scientifically justified. Years have passed since one of the key technical documents that will guide the cleanup was prepared. Appropriately, DTSC is requiring updates to that document to reflect the best available science. This is consistent with US EPA guidance and validated by independent scientists at the Office of Environmental Health Hazard Assessment. I believe in transparency, and today, DTSC published a detailed memo explaining the rigorous scientific basis supporting the update. The science is incontrovertible. You will hear from critics that the only measure of safety is how much soil is removed from the site. Reducing cancer risks to 1 in a million is the standard used by public health experts, and it's precisely what DTSC will use to measure the efficacy of our efforts and the standard to which we will hold Boeing accountable under the Resident with Garden cleanup. I know that there's been a lot of trust lost over the decades of inaction. I know that it's hard to come together after years of fighting. I have fought polluters my entire life and would not stand behind this agreement if it did not hold Boeing accountable to a cleanup standard that protected human health and the environment. I hope that today we can answer your questions in a way that begins a journey towards healing the community. Finally, I just want to express my gratitude to each of you for your courage and tenacity in the long battle to get to where we have arrived today. And with that, I'll turn it back over to DTSC. Thank you.
Thank you, Jared. I'd like to now introduce our director, Dr. Meredith Williams, to share some opening remarks about how we're moving forward together.
Thank you, Marcia, and thank you, Jared, for your comments. We've been asked a number of times over the past several weeks why enter into mediation with Boeing. Given the track record and given the challenges of our interactions with Boeing in the past. We did this because it resolves disputes over Boeing's obligations to soil and groundwater cleanup. It develops a process for achieving comprehensive cleanup and limits delays from further litigation. And it finally moves the cleanup forward, preventing those delays. and facilitates faster decision-making. Before we entered into mediation, we made it clear to Boeing from the initiation of the conversation that it was our intention to hold them to a highly protective cleanup standard, resident with garden. We assumed our role as the regulator every step of the way. The outcomes of the agreement, a cleanup of radioactive waste to background levels, a commitment to no litigation of a chemical contaminant cleanup standard of up to and including resident with garden, and clear deliverables and timelines for implementation of the agreement are a major step forward in this cleanup. And it's critical that this cleanup move forward. Everyone on the line has participated, many of you for decades, in the cleanup of the site and has that sense of urgency about the need to move it forward. As we share that sense of urgency, but we would not compromise public health and environmental protection to move the cleanup forward, and we have not through this agreement. I understand that there are concerns about the proposed cleanup, and I can assure you the risks that will guide the cleanup are based on current science that has been vetted by state, national, and international experts and scientific leaders. Further, the cleanup will not just be based on calculations alone. Calculations do not dictate how much soil will actually be moved. Only confirmation sampling can do that. Only once it's been established that the amount of contamination left in the soil meets that threshold of 1 in a million cancer risk or less than 1 hazard index, would we approve and agree that the cleanup is final. We will be careful throughout this cleanup to balance the need to clean up contamination without damaging the unique habitats and cultural resources at SSFL. DTSC is committed to transparency. This meeting is intended to provide you with an understanding of the settlement agreement and answer your questions about what the agreement means. We know you to be a highly informed community, highly engaged, deeply invested in this cleanup. We are prepared to speak to technical issues because the devil is in the details, and great care was taken during this mediation to craft a detailed enough settlement that we can be confident that it will result in a safe, protective cleanup. With that, I'll turn it back to Marcia. Thank you.
Thank you, Director Williams. Next slide, please. For those of you who may be new to this project, this slide provides basic information about the historical operations of the site, the size of the site, and identifies the parties responsible for investigating and cleaning up the site. They include Boeing, the Department of Energy, and the National Aeronautics and Space Administration. DTSC is the lead regulatory agency responsible for overseeing the activities of these responsible parties. Next slide, please. Here you'll see the different boundaries within the site, along with the areas of responsibility for each responsible party. Boeing areas are highlighted, as well as the Area 1 burn pit, which is slated for early action, and we'll discuss later in the presentation. Next slide, please. Before we dive into the settlement agreement, I'd like to note that though a formal cleanup has yet to begin at SSFL, there are several important actions we've taken to ensure that people in the environment are protected. We've finished 15 interim soil cleanups. We have ongoing groundwater cleanup under the groundwater interim measures that we refer to as the GWIM. All 3 responsible parties have demolished and removed several buildings to prepare for soil cleanup. And a stormwater treatment system was installed and is monitored to prevent pollution from leaving the site. Next slide, please. As you can see, a lot of work has already been done. Before the settlement agreement, we had a cleanup agreement in place known as the 2007 consent order. The settlement agreement resolves prior disputes about the process, cleanup, and decision-making under the 2007 consent order. It also facilitates the cleanup of Boeing's areas of responsibility using streamlined processes, establishes a mechanism for quickly resolving any potential future disputes, and increases penalties, like course correcting if you've taken an unexpected turn. The settlement agreement is consistent with and strengthens the 2007 consent order. That order outlined a risk-based cleanup of soil and groundwater for all three responsible parties. We'll talk more about what risk-based cleanup means later in our presentation. The agreement secures Boeing's commitment to clean up radiological contamination to background levels. Like Jared said, returning the land to its condition before industrial activity. This goes beyond the risk-based standard called for in the 2007 agreement. Some sections of the 2007 consent order are replaced by the settlement agreement to expedite the regulatory process while maintaining stringent cleanup standards. The new cleanup schedule is a good example of this. The chemical cleanup for Boeing will remain a risk-based cleanup as identified in both documents and secures Boeing's agreement to accept any cleanup standard chosen by DTSC up to and including a resident with garden standard. Next slide, please. This slide specifically outlines the differences between the 2007 consent order and the 2022 settlement agreement. You may hear some of this repeated throughout the presentation because we want to make sure we're explaining this as thoroughly as possible. Next slide, please. Now to the details of the agreement itself. Here are some of the key elements that we're excited to share with you and will be the focus of our presentation. Keeping in mind that the settlement agreement is a process document, it bolsters the 2007 consent order, carving a path to arrive at cleanup documents more quickly while maintaining their quality. The standardized risk assessment methodology, known as the SRAM, was developed to provide specific detail to Boeing on applying the risk-based cleanup standard at SSFL. We needed to document a methodology because a resident with garden standard is not widely used, and it is the goal for the chemical cleanup in Boeing's areas of responsibility. The methods outlined in the SRAM have remained the same, but must be updated to reflect changes in science. Boeing will clean up radionuclides to background levels that would exist locally without industrial activities. Subject to the terms of the settlement agreement, Boeing agreed to accept DTSC's selection for cleanup levels up to and including the resident with garden standard exposure scenario. Agreement to use elements of the RCRA First toolkit developed by the US EPA will streamline and accelerate the cleanup of contaminated sites. The Area 1 burn pit is where most of the radiological contamination for Boeing is located and will be cleaned up as early as next year. The settlement agreement is consistent with CEQA because it does not result in selection of any particular course of action or substantive decisions. An accelerated cleanup schedule resulted from the mediation and can be found in the agreement itself. Next slide, please. I'd like to give a little background on what the standardized risk assessment methodology, which going forward I'll refer to as the SRAM, is before we speak about the updates that have been made. Important to remember is that updates to risk assessments make them more accurate. The SRAM is a work plan required under the 2007 consent order with Boeing. NASA, DOE, and DTSC provides the risk assessment methods for a risk-based cleanup at the site. There are 9 areas that will be treated individually for Boeing, will include both pre and post cleanup risk assessments for a total of 18 planned. More will be conducted based on meeting cleanup goals. The 2000 consent order assumed that the SRAM would be updated. In fact, the last update was in 2014. Risk-based screening levels are media-specific, such as soil, and chemical-specific, like lead. Their concentrations and they correspond to cancer risk or non-cancer risk. An example of a non-cancer risk is asthma. For a resident For a residential exposure scenario, screening levels are calculated for 1 in a million cancer risk, the most protective level used by US EPA. The SRAM uses the best available science to provide the risk assessment methodology for human health and ecological receptors for a risk-based cleanup. The estimated soil volumes for a resident with garden scenario will be included in the final programmatic environmental impact report, our CEQA document for the project. As mentioned earlier, we needed to document this methodology because this resident with garden standard is not widely used and is the goal for the cleanup of Boeing areas. Cleanup alternatives for the site will be evaluated using the data in the risk assessment reports prepared by following the SRAM. They'll be in the proposed cleanup document for the Boeing areas. DTSC will evaluate the cleanup document and make a final remedy decision following public review and comment. Next slide, please. So SRAM updates were necessary due to changes in science, guidance, and regulations. The methods outlined in the SRAM are the same, and DTSC makes sure we're using authoritative values and guidance. In this case, we're using values and guidance that are curated and updated on a regular basis. Like a cell phone or computer software, updates are needed to keep systems functioning properly and safely. DTSC uses US EPA guidance in the risk assessment information system to keep risk calculations current. The greatest changes that impacted the SRAM were the mass loading factor, the amount of soil that attaches to a plant, toxicity criteria, how toxic a chemical is, and what's called the contaminated fraction, meaning all homegrown protocetin is grown on soil cleaned up to a particular level for a garden scenario. Some updates to chemical screening levels are based on the corrected mass loading factor. A couple of examples of these are formaldehyde and naphthalene. They were updated to more stringent levels. Benzo-K-fluoranthene and cresene were updated to less stringent levels. DTSC provided clear direction on how to revise the 2014 SRAM. And Boeing and DTSC both agreed to an expedited process for preparing, reviewing, approving the revised SRAM, and approving the revised SRAM. This will ensure all risk assessments will be completed and approved in accordance with the updated schedule. Next slide, please. I just mentioned that one of the key changes to the SRAM was the mass loading factor. We've heard some concerns and want to explain the scientific need for the update. The risk assessment for the resident with garden cleanup scenario evaluates how much soil is taken up into lettuce through roots and how much contamination is left on it. Mass loading factor is the amount left on the lettuce. The 2014 SRAM expressed the value for contamination in lettuce in terms of fresh produce. The mass loading factor, or MLF, the on-plant factor in terms of dehydrated produce. There were two problems with this approach. Expressing the MLF factor in terms of dehydrated lettuce is unrealistic because people usually eat fresh lettuce. Importantly, the 2014 SRAM inconsistently used different units for the in-plant and on-plant inputs to the formula. One input was expressed in terms of fresh and the other in terms of dehydrated. You need to use consistent units across a single formula. For example, if you're trying to calculate the distance a person has run in 2 days, and they say, I ran 5 miles today, and then the next day they ran 10 kilometers, you can't add 5 plus 10 to get 15. You need to convert the 10 kilometers to miles before adding it to the 5 miles to have a clear understanding of how far that person has run. That's exactly what DTSC did here. DTSC converted the MLF factor from dehydrated values to fresh so that it would be the same units as the in-plant factor. DTSC made this change based on authoritative sources. In 2016, Oak Ridge National Laboratory's Risk Assessment Information System database updated the MLF so that it was expressed in terms of fresh produce weight. And a 2021 US EPA guidance document also calls for that conversion to ensure that risk assessments are in consistent units. There is no scientific justification for using a formula with inconsistent units. Sound science requires this update to the MLF. It is critical to note that while the MLF has been updated, the level of protectiveness remains the same. The risk assessment methodology still calls for the same cleanup goal. Contamination must be removed until the risk of cancer is reduced to 1 in a million, and non-cancer risks are reduced to a hazard index of 1, meaning that risks to those to non-cancer impacts are negligible. In an effort to provide assurance to concerned stakeholders, independent scientists at the Office of Environmental Health Hazard Assessment reviewed and validated DTSC's update, finding it to be scientifically supported and consistent with appropriate guidance. This is a complex technical issue, so we published a short paper to explain it in detail. We welcome you to take a look for yourself. It is currently posted on our website. Next slide, please. DTSC is considering a range of cleanup alternatives as required by the California Environmental Quality Act and the Resource Conservation Recovery Act. These alternatives are all based on the best available science, and our goal is a resident with garden cleanup standard. The resident with garden cleanup standard means it would be safe for people to live on the land and eat produce grown in their gardens. During mediation, Boeing agreed to accept cleanup standards selected by DTSC up to and including the resident with garden standard. Next slide, please. A cleanup plan outlining options and making a recommendation will be developed. I understand that there have been concerns about the 5 times multiplier factor and that it weakens the cleanup standards. Let me be clear, that is not the case. 5 times multiplier is a method used in cleanup planning. It applies to cumulative risk or the risk from all of the chemicals taken at one sampling location together, rather than considering each individual screening level for each chemical. For the resident with garden exposure scenario, using a 5 times multiplier to identify areas for soil removal at each site being evaluated in the cleanup plan. After cleanup is conducted in each area, Boeing must perform a risk assessment to show that they've met DTSC's cleanup goals. If standards are not met, Boeing will be required to remove additional soil until they are, and the target for chemical cleanup is a 1 in a million cancer risk. Next slide, please. As part of the CEQA process, DTSC must consider cultural and biological resources while planning and conducting cleanups. This is actualized by using institutional controls like land use restrictions and monitoring to ensure cleanup standards are protective while preserving these important resources. There are a variety of cultural and biological resources in Boeing's areas of responsibility for cleanup. Some include tribal areas of significance, and others include endangered plant species or animal habitat. The PEIR identifies areas of the site that may include biological exemptions. They will be evaluated on a case-by-case basis. For example, protected resources like Ronton's milkvetch, a plant growing on the site, the red-legged frog, and golden eagle nests are considered highly significant and must be preserved. Other resources are considered less sensitive and may be able to be removed and or restored. These areas will be evaluated in close consultation with the California Department of Fish and Wildlife, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and tribes with cultural ties to the land. Evaluation gives DTSC the flexibility to take into account public health while balancing the need to preserve these important biological and cultural resources. DTSC, in coordination with these agencies and tribal representatives, may require alternative cleanup levels and approved exception areas to preserve the biological and cultural resources. This is consistent with applicable federal, state, and local laws and regulations. Under federal and state regulations, DTSC is authorized to use a risk management range of 1 in 10,000 to 1 in a million. That's 100 times difference. When an alternative cleanup standard is used, monitoring and institutional controls like land use restrictions will be required. It's important to note that whatever range is used, cleanup will be protective of ecological receptors, wildlife, and people. Next slide, please. Additionally, radionuclides site-wide will be cleaned up to background. 2007 consent order required Boeing to clean up soil and groundwater to risk-based levels. This included radionuclides. The 2007 administrative orders on consent required NASA and DOE to clean up radionuclides and chemicals to background. This 2022 settlement agreement affirms that Boeing will clean up radionuclides to background. This is still subject to the CEQA process and also will be evaluated in the cleanup document. This is a significant outcome of the agreement because now radionuclides site-wide be cleaned up to background levels by all 3 responsible parties. Next slide, please. Groundwater is already being cleaned up at several locations at the site under DTSC direction. That's the groundwater interim measure, or GWIM, I mentioned earlier. The GWIM will continue and may be part of the final groundwater cleanup. In our active groundwater monitoring program, sampling is conducted on a regular basis. Additional sampling takes place when needed. Water levels are monitored quarterly. Groundwater contamination is contained on site with the exception of trichloroethene, a commonly used industrial solvent, and its degradation products found in groundwater up to about 1,000 feet beyond the northeast portion of the property towards Black Canyon Road. Those reports are available on EnviroStore and in our document library on our website. We've been coordinating more closely with the Los Angeles Regional Water Board for the last 3 years concerning groundwater cleanup, based on the phase of the project and moving toward the development of draft cleanup documents. This includes the mediation with Boeing, and their role is addressed in the publicly available settlement agreement. RCRA corrective measures, RCRA corrective action guides DTSC's groundwater cleanup, as well as the Water Board standards and requirements. We consult with the Water Board to ensure that we're meeting both. Next slide, please. A more efficient and streamlined process, known as RCRA First, was agreed upon during the mediation. RCRA First, developed by US EPA, is based on lessons learned by federal, state, and regulated community representatives involved with cleanups. It addresses the root causes of delay by addressing unclear or non-specific cleanup objectives and starts with everyone involved understanding the objectives and recommending a remedy. It also ensures cleanup activities are done right the first time, resolves disputes to keep cleanups moving, and stays within the framework of the corrective action program. RCRA First will apply to most aspects of Boeing's cleanup at SSFL. Exhibit 4 to the settlement agreement identifies the RCRA First tools that will apply here. For example, DTSC and Boeing agree that Boeing will submit a focused corrective measure study for its soil cleanup remedy and elements of the groundwater cleanup remedy. The process and details in the identified RCRA First tools will be used to accelerate the preparation, review, and approval of cleanup documents. Public participation requirements remain the same under the RCRA First process. So you'll still have an opportunity to review and comment on those proposed cleanup plans. Next slide, please. We mentioned earlier in the presentation that the Area 1 burn pit is slated for early action. The Area 1 burn pit operated from about 1958 to 1951. It was used to destroy chemicals by setting them on fire or through combustion. Right now, the geotextile fabric that covers the burn pit is intact and secure, and contamination on site does not pose a threat to human health, wildlife, or other ecological receptors. The measures being taken in an abundance of caution. There is potential threat to wildlife and other ecological receptors in the Area 1 burn pit. This is due to changes in regional weather patterns resulting from climate change. This could mean more severe rainstorms, wildfires, or high wind events. These could damage or destroy the fabric covering part of the Area 1 burn pit. That would expose wildlife and other ecological receptors to the covered soils and render the fabric ineffective to protect against potential runoff and migration of hazardous substances. Boeing is developing a work plan for this interim action that will be reviewed by DTSC. When DTSC considers the work plan sufficient, a schedule will be developed. Any need for additional cleanup will be evaluated when the cleanup levels are determined. This interim action is exempt from CEQA because it qualifies as an emergency project. Notices will be distributed prior to and during the cleanup. Just to be clear, this is being taken as a precaution. Right now, people and other receptors are safe from contamination on site. Next slide, please. With every project, DTSC must adhere to the California Environmental Quality Act. Settlement agreement is consistent with CEQA because rather than determining a course of action or substantive decisions, it describes the processes that parties have agreed to for arriving at those decisions. DTSC reserves all of its rights on making a final remedy decision. After public review and comment on the cleanup document, DTSC will select the final remedy and approve the Boeing project under CEQA. The process outlined in the settlement agreement follows all applicable regulations. Next slide, please. All of the components that we've described here tonight strengthen the cleanup in various ways and bring us to implementation more quickly. Signing the agreement sets up an efficient process for cleanup decisions. The certification of the PEIR will enable the cleanup process to move forward. The Area 1 burn pit safeguards against changing environmental conditions. Cleanup decision documents getting approved will bring us to implementation, and implementation will get us a safe and enjoyable environment. The agreement avoids costly disputes and litigation that would delay the cleanup. Next slide, please. Following the certification of the PEIR, we'll announce the availability of the final document, upload it to EnviroStore, our online database, and place hard copies in all of our repositories. We'll then turn toward developing a comprehensive engagement plan, the next phase of the project, beginning with a community survey. In 2024, we'll hold 2 comment periods, one for a soil cleanup document and one for ground-up cleanup document. Each will include community hearings and ways to comment. There will be online comment forms, the hard copy forms that you're used to seeing, verbal comments accepted at public hearings, and there will be 2 public hearings for each. We'll develop the responses to the comments, and once that's completed, those who commented will receive a copy, and we'll be able to start the cleanup. They'll also keep people connected to our work with our monthly reports, website updates, mailings, and email distributions. Next slide, please. I know we've shared a lot tonight, and so I want to turn toward our question and answer portion of the meeting. There are 3 ways you can ask a question tonight. If you joined by phone, press *69. We'll read the last 3 digits of your phone number. Press *6 to unmute yourself, state your name, and ask your question. If you joined by Zoom, you can type the questions into the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen to have your question read aloud, or use the raised hand feature at the bottom of the screen to ask questions. We ask that people be brief because we know there are a lot of folks here who may have questions tonight. So we open those up. And we're going to start with a few of the folks who've raised their hands. I'm going to invite Chris Rowe to unmute and ask your question.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. Thank you.
Thank you for taking my question. I actually received emails from people that are considering moving into this area. And I've also talked to people that have avoided moving to this area because of the stuff that's in the media. For example, the most recent documentary and other things. Can DTSC please make a statement about offsite risk to the best of their knowledge? Because I've been trying to share the information that I've gained from DTSC, that there is no known offsite risk at this time. I'd appreciate a response. Thank you.
Thanks, Chris. I think we've had this conversation before, and we do maintain that no contamination traveling off site poses a risk to human health or the environment. I think if people are looking for references to that, it's clearly stated on our website. Would anyone from the project team like to add to that? Okay. I think that's pretty much our definitive answer, and we stand by that now.
Do you have a fact sheet out there that you could just put out, please? A current fact sheet?
I don't think we have a fact sheet per se. I think it is in our frequently asked questions on our website. I'll follow up and make sure that it's there and make sure that you've got something you can share, okay?
Thank you.
Thanks, Chris.
Marcia,
Now
you're
I'm muted. Adam Salkin, I see your hand raised as well. I'm going to invite you to unmute and ask your question, please.
Yes, hi. I have a lot of questions, but I've limited myself to 4. I'll get through them as fast as I can. It's bad enough we're on Zoom and that you have the power to cut me off, but please let me ask my questions and stay on the line to make sure that you understand them without putting me on mute. After reading an 800-page agreement and preparing these questions, I believe I do deserve that. My first question, I also have other people here if we need other time, and it won't take that long, but there's other people here that can finish, but I would rather finish my questions. My first question, page 5, paragraph 3 of the agreement states that DTSC and Boeing disagree on the cleanup standards. Page 6 states that Boeing's position is that 150,000 cubic yards is a protective cleanup for the SSFL, while DTSC believes that a protective cleanup could mean 440,000 cubic yards of contaminated soil that must be excavated and disposed of. I've been following this cleanup and documenting it for many years. The DTSC has told me on camera that as much as 2.5 million cubic yards of soil could have to be excavated during the cleanup, while Boeing themselves have told me that the range for the cleanup excavation is from 440,000 cubic yards to 1.6 million. In case you don't believe me, here's a clip of Tom Gallagher of Boeing saying exactly that.
We believe the cleanup could be anywhere from 400,000 cubic yards of soil to the removal of 1.6 million cubic yards of soil.
And this agreement you've made allowing Boeing to only clean up 150 cubic yards is giving them well below their dream scenario for a cleanup, but it's a nightmare for the surrounding community that will continue to have to live around this contamination. So why, with DTSC as the lead agency, in the role of overseeing this cleanup to protect public health, are you not able to tell Boeing what the cleanup must be and stick to the standard that even your agency feels is protective? Why is Boeing getting away with the cleanup that is 2/3 under their best case scenario? That's my first question.
Okay, so I want to be sure that we're responding to the question accurately. Is your question about soil volumes and how much may be removed?
My first question is about how much soil Boeing and DTSC always believed that it would take to clean up this site, the amount of soil that would need to be removed, being between 440,000 and 2.5 million cubic yards. But here in the agreement, it says 150,000 is what they're being held to.
So I'm not sure who from the project team would be. Okay, so Mindy, will you please address the soil volume question?
Yes. Hi, Adam. Thank you for the question. So there are a lot of different volumes being floated around. So the 100-something cubic yards that Boeing thinks is appropriate is based on a recreator scenario. The 400 cubic yards that is estimated for a resident with garden scenario, which is, by the way, the one that DTSC thinks is most appropriate and is our goal to achieve that cleanup level, is about 400,000 cubic yards. And that is the estimate that was presented in our draft programmatic environmental impact report. And so that has long been an estimate that DTSC has had for the volume of cleanup that would be required for Boeing areas. I think that quote from Tom Gallagher may have been out of context. I don't know if he was talking about the entire Santa Susana Field Laboratory when he's talking about that range of cleanup volumes. I'm not
Talking about
really
the
sure.
Boeing part, answering for Boeing, he is talking about the Boeing areas.
Well, that isn't the one. Oh, go ahead, Steve.
Mindy, this is Steve Becker. I'm the branch chief for the Santa Susana Field Lab. Adam, I believe that number that you're referencing as an upper bound of 1.6 billion yards is most likely an estimate of overall site cubic yardage between the three responsible parties. And that number, if I recall correctly, is probably closer to 2.5 million yards total. I don't remember the exact numbers, but as Mindy indicated, the 150,000 cubic yards you referenced is based on a recreator scenario. The 440,000 cubic yards is based on a resident with garden, which is our target for cleanup for the Boeing areas of responsibility. So I think that upper number may have been a reference to something site-wide and may have been before some of these numbers were calculated. But I don't know, honestly. I don't know the context of it.
So what is the cleanup standard? How many cubic yards are you talking about being removed?
Well, for the Boeing area of responsibility, you know, we've calculated about 440,000 cubic yards approximately of soil that would be removed. And that's for human health. There could be other soil that would need to be removed as they get into the removal. There also could be additional yardage that may need to be removed for protection of groundwater.
So it's not the 150,000?
Correct. That's correct. Absolutely.
Page 203, 204 of Exhibit 14 states that backfill can be used from on-site locations and that some of the backfill that can be used may not meet applicable cleanup standards, and that if backfill that meets the standard is not available, then no excavation of the surface soil would be needed. This means that if they can't find clean soil on-site to use as backfill, that they don't have to excavate contaminated soil. So why not just bring in clean soil from off-site to be used as backfill to continue cleanup?
Steve and Adam, I'm gonna stop there since we've responded to the soil volume question. I'm gonna ask you to be patient and allow a few other questions to move through. Right now, we're gonna have one question per person. So I'm gonna invite you to raise your hand again later as we move through and respond to as many folks as we can. All right, thank you. We're going to take one more raised hand, and then we'll go to some of the questions and the question and answer feature. Steve Shestak, will you please unmute yourself and ask your question?
Yes. Hello, this is Steve Shestak. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, thank you.
Good evening. My name is Steve Shestag, and I'm the Senior Director of Environmental Sustainability for the Boeing Company and the site leader for the Santa Susana site. Thank you for the opportunity to speak tonight. We have heard the concerns and understand the frustration raised by the community. We want to clean up the site as soon as possible, and we are committed to cleaning up our areas of responsibility in a way that ensures that the surrounding communities, users of the site, cultural resources, and the environment are all protected. Boeing agreed to the settlement because it provides regulatory certainty and a clear, accelerated path forward for Boeing's cleanup. We committed to the community to never develop the property, And in 2017, we followed through on that promise by placing our property under a conservation easement to ensure that it will never be developed for residential or industrial uses, and that it will be permanently preserved as open space to protect the invaluable environmental and tribal cultural resources at the site. Bowing's property will be protected forever, consistent with Ventura County's objective for the preservation of open space in critical habitats, as well as supporting the state's initiative to preserve 30% of California's land as open space. Under this agreement, Boeing is required to do far more than what California law requires to protect human health and the environment for an open space property. The resident with 100% garden standard is more stringent than the unrestricted use standard DTSC requires for contaminated sites, including those that will be developed for residential use. Under this settlement agreement, Boeing has agreed not to challenge a cleanup to a resident with 100% garden standard if that is a remedy selected by DTSC. The agreement will also help protect the important environmental and tribal cultural resources at the site as required by other governmental agencies and DTSC policy. Turning now to other key details of the settlement. Boeing has agreed to clean up radionuclides in soil in our area's responsibility to background levels, which is beyond what is required in the 2007 consent order. Boeing has agreed to start cleanup of the Area 1 burn pit as soon as possible as an interim action. Boeing also has agreed, following the completion of the soil cleanup, to conduct years of post-cleanup monitoring and to prepare a human health risk assessment to demonstrate that stormwater runoff is not polluted. And the expedited timeline, streamlined process, dispute resolution procedure in the agreement accelerates Boeing's cleanup. We recognize that the community is frustrated and has concerns. We agree that the cleanup has been delayed for far too long. This settlement ensures that the cleanup will be completed in a timely and protective manner. Boeing is committed to cleaning up its area's responsibility at Santa Susana as soon as possible and in a way that ensures that the surrounding communities, users of the site, the cultural resources, and the environment will all be protected. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to move to some of the questions in our Q&A feature. We have a question about, sorry, there's a lot of them coming in, about why we need a new agreement from Rachel Butler. So I'm going to ask someone from our project team to respond to why we need that agreement. Steve? Andy? Can everyone hear me okay?
Yes, this is Steve. We needed a new agreement, and it's important to understand. Thank you for the question. It's important to understand that the original 2007 agreement did have certain specifications within it. However, upon recent review discussions, it was determined that it would be much better to bolster that agreement and make it more enforceable and make it so that we can actually get to the cleanup. And so it's a process document, as we talked about earlier. It creates a framework to allow us to get from the point that we're at this point to cleanup. And it's got a schedule in it. It's very specific. It binds both parties to a very quick dispute resolution. And really, it's meant to get things kind of unstuck. You know, there were some disagreements, disputes over the course of years, and this really works to do a nice job of resolving those and allow the project to move forward in a timely manner. So it's very important. It builds upon the 2007 consent order. Certain portions of it supersede it. As we talked about, we're using best available science to update the SRAM with no delay to getting to cleanup. So, you know, we feel it's very important. We also, got Boeing's commitment to clean up radionuclides to background, which was something that previously they had not agreed to. Previously, it was background. So, you know, our overall feeling is that it creates a nice process framework to getting us actually to get shovels in the ground.
All right, thanks, Steve. I see a lot of questions coming through about cleaning up the radiological contamination to background. So Mindy, can you please start addressing that topic? I'll start putting them in the answered section so people can see them.
Yes, thank you for the questions regarding cleaning up radionuclides to background. The 2007 consent order between DTSC, Boeing, DOE, and NASA contemplated risk-based cleanup for chemicals and radionuclides. In the 2022 settlement agreement with DTSC and Boeing, Boeing agreed to clean up radionuclides to background levels in soil at their areas of responsibility. So this secures a site-wide agreement for cleanup of radionuclides to background. This is something that Boeing agreed to do as part of the settlement agreement. Therefore, that's the reason that it's a different standard than for chemical constituents. DTSC follows the regular procedures of risk-based cleanup and is not able to require responsible parties to clean up to background levels unless the responsible parties agree to do so. Are there any other questions about radionuclides that I did not address?
Yeah, there's one from Daniel Brin. Where will radionuclides be taken? So I think that's basically regarding disposal.
Sure, radionuclides will be characterized and disposed of properly in accordance with state laws and regulations. And DTSC will oversee the characterization and disposal of all the materials cleaned up at the site.
Okay, we still have quite a few raised hands, so I'm going to invite Mark O to unmute and please ask your questions. Question.
Yes, can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Okay, I have several questions to ask also. First one I also put in the Q&A box, and that concerns the rationale for imposing a standard of a resident with a garden on the cleanup when, given that Boeing's easement prohibits residents living on the site. So it doesn't seem to make any sense. It seems to be a huge waste of effort and jeopardizes both the cultural and natural resources on the site as well as the residents downstream. So I'd like an answer to that question. Next question is
Mark, I'm gonna ask you to pause there so that we can go on to that one first.
Okay.
Thanks. Cindy?
Marcia, I could,
Yeah.
if you would like, I could take that.
Sure. Please go ahead and start your video.
Hi there, this is Larry Havitz, I'm Chief Counsel. On that point, I will just note that we recognize that Boeing has recorded an easement. DTSC strongly believes that that easement isn't applicable here, and we are not bound by it. So resident with garden is an appropriate cleanup standard.
Pardon me, but it's a matter of fact that there will not be any residents living there. So it's not a matter of law, sir. It's a matter of rationality.
I'll just follow up and say I'm not, sir. I'm not entirely sure. We are taking a conservative, aggressive cleanup that would allow any foreseeable land use, including residential. We don't know, with all the development pressures happening in Southern California, whether or not land use entitlements will be allowed for residential at the site. And we're being aggressive in allowing and affording the ability for resident with garden.
You're ignoring part of the question, and that's the impact on the downstream folks who have to put up with the transport of the waste materials through their communities. Such as my own community. And I wish people would stop using the community as if it's a monolith. There's a lot of disagreement among community members. So I would greatly appreciate it if the representatives here would stop using the community in such a way as to indicate that there's total agreement among community members.
I hear you, Mark. Larry's addressed the question, and we're gonna move on to another one while he's on, related to the document itself. And if you have more questions, please raise your hand later. We want to just try to make sure we respond up to one question at a time and get in as many as we can. Thanks. So the question I have here is, why was there no public hearing prior to the signing of the document?
I'll take that.
Yeah, I figured while you're here, it would be a
Sure.
good time to.
Thank you for the question. There is no state law requirement for a public hearing for this kind of an agreement. It is a process document. It's not a cleanup standard decision. And the reason, and there's no requirement that we have a public hearing, and we made the decision to agree to the process and sign the settlement agreement, and then have this public forum to explain what the settlement is about.
Okay, thanks, Larry. Take another raised hand. We have someone with the initials RA. I'll ask you to please go ahead and unmute and ask your question. RA? Your hand raised. It looks like our participant is having a little trouble unmuting, so I'll go to another hand raised. Steve Randall, you please unmute yourself and ask your question.
Yeah, very simple question. I was just wondering if you could bring up.
I'm sorry, you cut out for a second, Steve.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay, so I was wondering if you could bring up page 4 of the presentation.
Sure. Chin, could you please bring up page 4?
Yes, give me 1 second, please.
Thanks.
And during this, could you tell us when when and where the recording would be available?
We have a video specialist who will prepare the video for our website, and it should be available in a few days. It really just takes depends on him. Is this the page that you're looking for, Steve?
No, I believe it said number 4 at the bottom right corner.
It says this one says number 4 at the bottom right corner. So
I don't see that. It was a comparison of before and after comparison.
Oh, the 2007.
Right.
Okay.
It was up for a very short time.
Yeah. Chin, will you please find that one? There we go.
That's it. Beautiful.
And did you have a question about this slide?
No, actually, I co-chair the Environment Committee for the West Hills Neighborhood Council, and we'll be doing a presentation to fill people in on this meeting, and I just wanted to have this information in front of me. Thank you so much.
Yeah, sure. Steve, the presentation will also be available on our website following the meeting. So you'll be able to find that there.
Okay, yeah, our meeting is.
And then after the meeting, everyone who's joined, we have an email list, and so you'll get an e-blast letting you know that the presentation materials are available. So you'll be updated.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Marcia.
Sure. Thanks, Steve.
Thank you.
Hey, Marcia, you're on mute.
Thanks, Mindy. We'll take a question from Bonnie, and then we'll read a few more from the Q&A.
Yes, I was wondering what is in the Area 1 burn pit. I was called last week and told someone I did not know told me there was a reactor in there and sodium, and that it's a ticking time bomb. That's why they've never cleaned it up.
Thanks for your question, Bonnie. So I think Mindy can address the type of contamination that's there.
Yes. Hi, Bonnie. Thank you for your question. So I think there's a little bit of confusion between the Area 1 burn pit and the sodium burn pit. So the Area 1 burn pit.
No, this is the Area 1.
Okay. The Area 1 burn pit didn't have any reactor activity. It was a burn pit that was used to detonate other materials, and it's being cleaned up now. For a while, it's been covered in tarps to protect it from offsite, from migrating offsite, to prevent contaminants from migrating offsite. And the main contaminants there are radionuclides, PAHs, and metals and dioxins. So those will be cleaned up. And basically the reason we want to do it now is because of the climate change and fire seasons getting more and more severe. And so we want to go ahead and get that cleaned up, and we're hoping to get that started next year.
All right. And then I was told by this person that contamination has moved off-site for 3 miles.
That is not correct. Contamination has not moved off-site for 3 miles.
Thank you.
All right.
Thank you.
Thanks, Bonnie. While we're on the topic of the burn pit, I'm gonna go to this question in the Q&A feature. How much radiation does Boeing need to clean up for burn pit, and how much radiation does DOE have? So if you have, could you speak to that, or do you have that detail, or would that be something found elsewhere? Mindy?
So I'm not sure about the volume of soil. That hasn't been estimated yet. We'll be getting a cleanup plan from Boeing after they do the risk assessment for that area. They're going to do an ecological risk assessment, and then they will prepare the work plan. Once the work plan is in a good state, then we will post it online for the public to be able to see that work plan, and more details will be available in the work plan.
Great, thanks, Mindy. I also see a question on a topic we haven't touched on yet about, oh, where did it go? It was about mechanisms in place to prevent the groundwater plume migration. So I'm gonna ask Mindy if you can respond to it, or I know we have other folks from our project team that can. So what mechanisms are in place? Yeah.
Oh, sure. Thank you. Thank you for the question. So groundwater is already being cleaned up at several locations under DTSC's direction, and that's the groundwater interim measure. And the groundwater interim measure is going to continue and may even be a part of the final groundwater cleanup. The settlement agreement, the one that we're talking about today, provides a streamlined process for further remediation of groundwater. According to the schedule in the settlement agreement, implementation of the final groundwater remedy will begin in mid-2025. And if you look at Exhibit 17 of the settlement agreement, it provides additional detail on the groundwater cleanup process.
Thanks, Mindy. We have a question about the schedule from Julie Korenstein. When is the final cleanup of land? When will the final cleanup of land be completed? So do you mind speaking to our accelerated schedule?
Yeah, so with this accelerated schedule, cleanup is anticipated to begin around 2025 for the Boeing areas of responsibility. We don't know how long it will take yet because we have not made a decision regarding the cleanup standard for Boeing areas of responsibility, although our goal is the resident with garden. The draft PEIR estimated that site-wide soil cleanup for Santa Susana Field Laboratory will take 10 to 15 years.
All right, thanks. And Doria is asking when DTSC will decide what the final cleanup standards will be. So those will be decided following public comment. And I think this is, also related to the schedule.
That's correct. Yes, so DTSC is going to certify the PEIR document, and we're hoping to do that this fall. That's the plan. After that, Boeing will submit their soil corrective measure study, and that document will feed into, it will lay out the alternatives for soil cleanup. And then based on that document, DTSC will propose a draft statement of basis, which is our decision, and that would propose a cleanup standard. That document would be made available for public review and comment, and we would have a public meeting before it would get approved.
Thanks, Mindy. I'm gonna pop in one more question from the Q&A, and then we'll go back to the raised hands. How does this apply to former employees at the site? From my understanding, the cleanup will be protective for those folks working on site and the surrounding community.
Yes, that's correct. Measures will be put into place to protect on-site workers and the surrounding community during cleanup. A dust monitoring plan will be required, and also there will be dust reduction and stormwater runoff prevention programs in place.
Okay, thank you so much. So I'm going to go back and take a few raised hands now. We have someone who signed on as Parents Against SSFL. You please go ahead and unmute and ask your question.
Hi, my apologies. I forgot to rename it, I guess. This is Melissa Bumstead with Parents Against SSFL. And my question has to do with the SRAM, because that's always my biggest concern since that actually listed out. I noticed that you guys seem to reference a lot of the information we've been putting out to the community, maybe even watched our video that we went through page by page and showed the public exactly how to read the charts in the SRAM and the differences between the 2007 SRAM and the current settlement agreement. I'm a little offended, to be honest, that the DTSC hasn't done that same courtesy and has instead just said that we are wrong. And that you have mentioned and referenced a document published today on the website, but you haven't pulled that up and gone through it with us. And I would just like to remind you that the public is capable of understanding this. We're very engaged, like you said, when we're able to learn. And you haven't really given us that courtesy to really show us actually you're talking about that there's no difference, but you're not showing us. So for example, when I pull up the suburban residential garden PAH chemicals, risk-based screening levels, that's the RBSLs, and I look at the polynuclear aromatic hydrocarbons from 2007 consent order, let's just pick one here, like the benzoatrazine had a 0.00008 milligrams per kilogram cleanup. But now if I look at the new agreement and the new settlement agreement, that's 0.176. That's 6 times less protective. And then I go to the, I don't know, that's crinthacine, 0.008. And now it's 17.9 micrograms per kilogram. That's 2,000 times less protective. And so when I go through the chart, you keep saying that it's not any different, but clearly I see in the numbers themselves that it is different. And I would have appreciated if someone had gone into that level of detail to even have in the new settlement agreement a comparison of all these numbers so that we could actually see what's going on. I feel like the community deserves that. And so I would like to know if you're saying that this isn't weaker when we compare the new chemicals, I'm just talking chemicals right now, the 2007 agreement to the new agreement, you say that they're stronger when actually the majority of them are weaker. And this doesn't even look at the whole 300 contaminants of concern historically documented at the SSFL. This is only a handful, and I don't know where those other chemicals are.
So thank you Thank you for your question, Melissa. We wanted to have this meeting to discuss the overarching topics of the settlement agreement. And so that's why we're not necessarily walking through all of the details about the SRAM. But Steve, part of the reason that we're here tonight is we're here for you. We want to hear from you, and we definitely want to help clear that up. So Steve's gonna try to address your questions, and hopefully this will help us, come to a shared understanding.
Thank you, Marcia. And thank you for the input, Melissa. I do appreciate and understand your concerns. I would like to reassure you that DTSC has gone through and looked at all the math and all the factors that are inputs to the SRAM and verified that they are scientifically accurate. So, and I'm going to let Kim Getman with our HERO group speak in a minute, but essentially, all the factors and parameters are the best available current science. And so at the end of the day, when you use those as inputs in the SRAM, you're going to come out with numbers that will be used ultimately to make risk-based decisions for cleanup levels. So, obviously there's differences in opinion on certain factors, but at this point, the department has come to rest on the factors that they believe are scientifically defensible and best available current science. So I wouldn't say that I think it's a little bit of a misrepresentation to say that we didn't pay much mind to the work that you and others within your group have done to look at those factors. I would say that our new updates to the SRAM are going to be scientifically sound and end up with a cleanup that is protective as intended, and hopefully will be to the resident with garden standard. But that, like I said, that gets determined. Hold on one second, please.
Oh, no, I'm sorry. I just wanted to clarify what you were saying so I understood exactly, but I'm sorry, keep going.
Oh, so that basically the cleanup decisions don't get made, until we get to those documents. So otherwise, it's not allowed under CEQA. So these are all cleanup levels to be, set in the future, in the decision documents. So I hope that helps address. I mean, we really have spent a lot of time going in and looking at everything in extreme detail. I don't think anybody could even begin to fathom how much work we've done on that. But with that said, if you have something else you want to say, otherwise I'll let Kim maybe weigh in a little bit more.
Sure. Yeah, I just wanted to clarify what you're saying then is that the numbers in the 2007 SRAM, even though they were more protective because there would be less chemicals left on site, they're not best science, and best science says that more chemicals should stay on site. That's the best science.
I think that's a misrepresentation, actually. I mean, the science is based on risk and hazard. So if there's an improvement or a change in a factor, it's meant to still be as protective, and it's meant to be utilized in the equations. I think that's the bottom line. And so, just because something was a factor at one point and it's a different factor now, if it's still deemed to be as protective in its current factor, then that's what it is, and it's scientifically sound, and it's appropriate to use in making risk management decisions. So always referring back to old science is not always a good mechanism, I guess is the best way to put it. And I would let Kim speak to that a little bit more.
Thank you, Steve. We recognize the change in the toxicity criteria, in particular for the polyaromatic hydrocarbons, the PAHs. And, tox criteria change, things get updated. One of the things that DTSC is obligated to follow is our toxicity criteria rule that went into effect in 2018. That toxicity criteria rule sets forth a hierarchy for which DTSC must select our toxicity criteria from. And the PAHs, the change in tox criteria from what was done in the 2007, or the values that that are calculated per the 2007 consent order, per the values that we are calculated now, fall underneath that rule. DTSC is obligated, and we must follow that toxicity criteria rule. That toxicity criteria was put out to the public and vetted, and represents the best available science that we have at this time. I hope that helps clarify. the changes in the tox criteria and in particular for PAHs.
Okay, thanks, Kim. We'll go to our next raised hand, and that looks like Daniel Hirsch. Please unmute and ask your question.
I don't have a question, I have a statement. This is an extraordinary couple hours propaganda by a captured regulatory agency about a backroom deal that it cut with one of the largest polluters in the country, a significant donor to the governor, and an entity that has a great deal of clout with this dysfunctional regulator. This is not about good science, it's about bad science. The vast majority of the cleanup numbers for even your best cleanup have been weakened. And they've been weakened by tremendous amounts. If you take a look at the PCBs, part of the area of the site will be cleaned up to factors 100 times weaker than in the prior order. Other parts, likely the majority, to several thousand times weaker. Same thing with the dioxins. Chemical after chemical, the vast majority of the changes that have been made have been to weaken things. What one has done is simply redefined suburban residential to give Boeing what it had always wanted as a recreator standard, the weakest standard possible. You just change the name on it. And you've set up a situation where there's no ability for the community or for the regional board members who may be listening to get any real information about the false statements that you've been making today and the misrepresentations. This is a sweetheart deal with a polluter done without any opportunity for public comment, without any environmental review. It's 800 pages long, largely written by the polluter with the state just signing off. You'll defend it to the end. You have to, because you've done a deal that will hurt people. These numbers are being relaxed by sometimes tens of thousands of fold. And this is simply because Boeing as a polluter is powerful, and DTSC is pretty much the tail on the dog that Boeing is wagging. People will die because of this. The vast majority of the contamination in Santa Susana will not get cleaned up. And you had promised us, Cal EPA had repeatedly promised there would be no negotiations with Boeing and that you were going to stick to and enforce the 2007 order. Then you went into secret negotiations and you created an order that supersedes it. And it cherry-picked number after number. When the new science says you need to tighten something, you ignore it. When you have a number you can weaken, you weaken it. So nobody listening to this should believe a word that has been said. This is a deal by an agency that's controlled by the polluter. And unless people fight back, more and more people are going to be harmed who live nearby.
Okay. Thank you for sharing your perspective, Mr. Hirsch. It looks like our director would like to address your statement.
Thank you, Dan. Thank you for your continued engagement on the cleanup. And as you know, we've been talking about some of the changes to the SRAM and to the values and the calculations for quite some time. And I would say that first and foremost, this deal was, if you want to call it a deal, this settlement agreement, this enforceable legal settlement agreement was done with a great deal of integrity and on the basis of the science. And in fact, you do make a point that numbers changed, and some numbers would lead to more rigorous standards, some were more relaxed. We have changes throughout the calculations in the SRAM that reflect the best available science. So for instance, there was an assumption about the ingestion rate of a child. That number has gone up by 30%. There were assumptions about body weight. Those numbers have changed. The science has evolved, the exposure scenarios, the duration of time that people are exposed to different chemicals. It has evolved significantly since the 2014 document, and it is our responsibility to revise the document. We and Kim Getman just laid out exactly what our obligations, statutory obligations are to follow the science and to use the science, the toxicity criteria being one example of that. We want to be transparent. We will continue to provide additional information. I know there's a question about the third-party review we got. We did get third-party review with respect to just one variable that changed. And again, several variables changed, and that being the mass loading factor. We got that review from the Office of Environmental Health Hazard Assessment. We do expect to get a similar assessment of whether or not our science is sound from US EPA. And again, we will post that on our website and make that available. It is important for us to make sure that people have confidence in the work that we've done here in terms of the science. So we will continue to make that, provide that validation whenever we can do that. And we think you are right. So as several of you have pointed out, you are a very sophisticated set of stakeholders, community members from various points of view, various perspectives. And therefore, I think it is the appropriate expectation that you get clarity on what the changes are, what the basis for them is, and what they mean in terms of the cleanup. The bottom line to the cleanup is that the standard to which we are operating is that if someone eats produce out of a garden in their backyard, they would have no more than a 1 in a million chance of cancer occurrence as a result of eating that produce. That has never changed. The soil itself, the volume of soil itself is not the determinant. It's the amount of contamination left in the soil, and that standard has not changed. No matter what the calculation, when we get a calculation of this amount of contamination is acceptable or would allow someone to continue to eat that garden produce and stay below that 1 in a million cancer risk, we then require a cleanup to that level or lower.
Thanks, Director Williams. We'll move to a raised hand from an attendee who we haven't heard from yet. Michael Walsh, will you please unmute and ask your question?
Hi, this is actually Christina Walsh using Michael Walsh's computer.
Hi, Christina. Thanks for joining us tonight.
Thank you. I want to say that I appreciate this framework and I support this finally being done. I think that it's important to have these deadline requirements and milestones, but those existed in the 2007 agreement and none of those were followed. It is true that $15,000 a day as a penalty is weaker. You know, if that had been imposed, it would amount to over $30 million today. $70,000 a day would equate to over $140 million in penalties. But again, zero, despite multiple requests, zero has been assessed. So I think it's important that we be able to have faith in this being possible. I'm concerned about this garden standard being really measurable. But I appreciate the update of the SRAM. I think that's needed and accept that. What we need more than anything in the world is actual cleanup that actually happens. One of the things that I think was very good in this was that you have a replacement soil step up so that if a garden scenario standard is not available, that you would step up to no garden so that there is something available and decisions can be made. And I would request that something similar to that be applied to the AOC federal agreements, because those have been stalemated for this reason, and zero cleanup protects nobody. So again, I support the framework. I think that it's long overdue, that there's an immediate and substantial endangerment order for the burn pit and an ongoing continued immediate and substantial endangerment order for the shooting range. But again, you know, right now as we sit here, I went out today and there are signs at every intersection that trucks are not allowed up or down from the site. So how can we be assured that the state is going to coordinate with the city and make sure that this can actually be implemented finally? And I look forward to your answers.
Thanks, You've covered a lot of ground there. And so what I heard are, some comments about the timelines, our penalties, support for updates to the SRAM, and some of these early actions that will be required to do, and we'll have to. And you're right, we'll have to coordinate with the cities, and property owners as well. So it looks like Mindy and Larry are both prepared to address some of these. So I'm going to go ahead and ask y'all to start where you're ready. Maybe Larry, you want to speak to the penalties and the timelines?
Sure, Ms. Walsh. I mean, a great observation about the sort of lack of enforcement of the 2007 consent order. That was one of the big problems with the 2007 consent order. And it resulted in disputes, litigation, and long, I don't have to tell you, long delays. What we're really happy about that we negotiated hard for in this agreement, not only did we increase the penalties of $70,000 per violation per day, which is big, we have a robust dispute resolution process embedded in the settlement agreement that will require DTSC and Boeing to quickly resolve disputes. And then if they don't resolve them informally, there will be a body of judges that will judicial panel of 3 to resolve these disputes. And then it's done. And if they say, yes, Boeing, you win, we're done with that. Or DTSC, you're right, it's done. It can't be taken to court. The tight timeframes will allow those disputes to be quickly resolved. As you can imagine, as people have talked about, this is a very extensive settlement agreement, over 800 pages. There will inevitably be differences of opinion in interpretation and implementation as the documentation proceeds and as the cleanup proceeds. That's why we needed good dispute resolution, because we recognize there will be those disputes, but we want them resolved quickly and finally and not end up in litigation. And that's what we have here. That's why it's this agreement represents a huge advantage over the 2007 consent order as it relates to enforcement.
Thank you, Larry. And I'll just add that there are other provisions with the settlement agreement that make for an expedited cleanup. So we've agreed to use the RCRA first model. And so that will expedite the corrective measure study documents and that process, although we will still have the same public process that we had envisioned before. We have developed a lot of templates for future documents that are included in this settlement agreement, and that will be more efficient review periods. And this settlement agreement also includes a commitment to schedule on both sides. So we will be posting updates to that schedule within a few weeks of any delays. So you will be informed as members of the public if there are any delays. I think you had some concerns about signs regarding trucks, traffic in the area. And yes, we will be working with all of the local agencies to make sure that we can complete this cleanup.
All right, thank you, Mindy and Larry. We're gonna go to Cindy Gortner now. Please unmute yourself and go ahead and ask your question.
Hi, everybody. So I'm confused about something. And thank you, Director Williams, for talking to us. And you're asking for confidence in your science. But what I'm hearing is it's best science. And my question, of course, is best science for who? It sounds a little bit like it's better for Boeing than it is for the people who live nearby. But here's my question. So if the SRAM has the standards that seem to be weaker, and I know Kim's telling us that the TOX criteria changes. Here's my question. What is more protective overall on the chemical contamination, the 2007 agreement or the one we have now?
So yeah, Mindy, thank you. Thanks for your question, Cindy. And Mindy's going to address the level of protectiveness.
Hi, Cindy. I think there's and a misconception that this is a perfect opportunity to address. The 2007 consent order talked about a SRAM document. It did not include the details for risk assessment or include values for risk-based screening levels. It always envisioned that the SRAM document, the risk document, would be updated and the RIVSOLs would be updated as updates occur. So the most recent version of the standardized risk assessment methodology document, or SRAM, is 2014. And we would have updated that document with or without the 2022 settlement agreement. We were planning to update it already. So whether we had entered into the settlement agreement or not, we would have required Boeing to update that document. And we directed Boeing on what updates needed to be made to that document. And we would have directed them the same way if there hadn't been the mediation. It's just a fortunate outcome of this mediation that we've figured out a faster way to get to a final SRAM document and we can get to cleanup.
But that's not answering my question. Which is more protective? When Dan Hirsch, who I trust implicitly, tells me that it's 100 times weaker on PCBs and 1,000 times weaker on other things, and there's a heck of a lot of stuff up there. You're talking about the burn pit with the dioxins in it. That's chemical. I want to know what's more protective. How do I feel safe when Melissa's reading me numbers that are much, much higher and you're trying to tell us that it's better science? It doesn't make sense.
The 2007 consent order is not less protective. The 2022 settlement agreement is the same level of protection as the 2007 consent order. Both are risk-based documents. So both contemplate cleanup of chemicals to risk-based levels.
But did those risk-based levels change to be less protective? Because that seems suspect to me. It's a little bit confusing.
Let me try and help out here a little bit, Cindy. So while some factors have changed, that were used in the original SRAM versus the to be developed updated SRAM, the important thing to recognize is that cleanup levels will be set to that 1 in a million cancer risk. That's the target cleanup goal. So no matter what changes in science have happened at the end of the day, the cleanup levels will be based on a target risk of a chance of 1 in a million of contracting cancer. Okay, so the change in the parameters is actually a little less important than the ultimate risk levels. I mean, the science has advanced. Some numbers go up, some numbers go down, but at the end of the day, the level of protectiveness is determined by setting the cleanup levels, which will be set to that target of 1 in a million.
That's helpful, Steve. So, but they did mention the duration of time of exposure. Director Williams mentioned that. Is that changing? Because that makes me nervous. If you're talking about that changing and you can just say, well, they're not going to be there as long and therefore we can have more chemical stuff stay there and pollute people down, wind and down river from it or down the hill where the rain comes down and washes all the crap down the hill. That makes me nervous.
Okay, so I think Kim can answer that. There was a change in that, and Kim, maybe you could address that for Cindy real quickly.
Yeah, sure. Cindy, yes, the exposure duration did change for the adult. US EPA updated their parameters, and that update was made back in 2016, 2017, somewhere in that area. I could be off by a year or two. The old value was a total of 24 years. And that number for the adult, and that number is now 20 years. So total time is 26 years, which when you add the child plus the adult, the child is 6 years, compared to the old value was 30 years. And that number was updated by US EPA, and that is the number that DTSC and US EPA uses in all of our risk assessments.
Is that kind of the basis of how the numbers got a little bit weaker, maybe?
That would be one factor that the number would definitely play into it.
But that doesn't make sense to me because you're talking about eating the food. So why does it matter? Does it matter if I'm eating the food for 24 years or 20 years or something like that? Is that how it works?
Yes. So that is in. So we take into consideration how many years are you going to be eating produce off of your land.
So is everyone below the site going to move after 20 years because people live there?
No, these are numbers that US EPA updates when they take a look at the national averages and their databases. And DTSC follows suit and following US EPA guidance.
It
And
sounds like you need to tell everybody to move sooner than they are, because people live there. So that's unfortunate, guys.
Understood.
Well, if I could add two things here. So with respect to people off-site, the risk assessment is based on somebody on site who's been exposed to the actual contamination on the site. And it really, that risk calculation does not translate to off-site.
Yes, but Director Williams, you know perfectly well that Boeing has many violations in the water runoff, and that doesn't seem to be stopping. And I haven't seen the most recent numbers from the big rains, but we know for a fact it's getting off-site because of the water violations. So that's not making any sense to me.
Okay. I'm not in a position to speak to the water violations. I don't know if somebody else wants to take that on or not, but and then I did want to return to the changes in the numbers. The change in the mass loading factor that Marcia walked through is the number change, the numerical value of that change is significant. It's it looks like a factor of 20. But again, this challenge of trying to add miles and kilometers and act as though that's a meaningful number, and that it's fundamentally problematic, and it would not be legally defensible, let alone scientifically defensible, for the department to knowingly proceed with that incorrect approach to setting the risk-based screening levels. So I did want to underscore, we recognize it is numerically, it's a significant change, and that's because the difference between a dry piece of lettuce and a wet piece of lettuce is significant. But now that calculation is self-consistent, it makes sense, and it is scientifically and legally defensible.
Okay.
Thank you so much, Director Williams and Steve and Kim, for addressing this. We're going to take a few more questions before we have to move to wrap up this evening. So I'm going to call on some folks who haven't yet had the opportunity to speak. Julie Korenstein, please go ahead and unmute and ask your question.
I did, and can you hear me? Can you hear
me?
Yeah.
Yes, we can hear you. Thanks, Julie.
Questions also through the chat, so I'm just going to read off what I said. I'm confused. Is the Boeing site to be left as open space or for building homes and gardens? Will there be any contamination left? What about other areas that are contaminated? Will those areas be cleaned up? The areas that are not Boeing, for example. And I did ask about when the final cleanup would be, and there's a remark there that it's been answered already. But then I heard, I think the attorney say that the land could be used for homes and gardens if there's a demand for development. So who will be held liable if people become ill? And the final question was, will the contaminated soil, how will it be transported, and will it be encapsulated? How will it be, protection from other people that live in the area?
Okay, so you've asked a lot of questions. It looks like
Marcia,
Larry wants to.
Yeah, I'd like to just clarify if I was confusing before, and I apologize, Ms. Korenstein. I didn't say, if I said it, I don't want to misrepresent the whole notion of residential out there. DTSC is not the agency that dictates land use. It's Ventura County and Simi Valley. So ultimately, whatever is used, whatever land uses are dictated out there will not be based on will not be a decision of DTSC. All DTSC is saying is we are cleaning up this site aggressively to allow for a resident with garden. And if in the future, Ventura County or the city of Simi Valley decides to allow that through their zoning and their general plan and all of their land use designations, our cleanup would allow for that. But again, we aren't deciding that. We're just saying we want to clean it up so that in the future, if residential is ever wanted out there, it would be allowed.
Yeah, I understand what you're saying, but at the same time, I don't know who is held liable for any of this, because I'm not convinced that it can ever be cleaned up enough, and certainly not by the information I've received this evening, that people may still get ill. I mean, I can't imagine living on that land and growing vegetables to feed my children. It's incomprehensible.
I'll just follow up. I mean, I'm not the toxicologist or the scientist here, but you know, I appreciate what you're saying, Ms. Corenstein. But Corenstein, I think what we're saying is we are confident that our cleanup standard would allow for it, once it's complete, someone to live on the site and grow their produce and eat that produce. That we are confident that that's what our cleanup standard would authorize. You know, if there are people you know, whether people decide that they want to live there or not is probably a different issue, but we know that we are moving to a cleanup standard that would allow someone to do that.
So Boeing would no longer be would not be held responsible, liable in any way if people become ill?
You know, I'm not in a position to talk.
I would just say that those are matters that typically are taken up in civil court. They're usually outside the realm of our authority and our purview.
Could I please get the answer about the other areas that Boeing is not that does not own? What happens to those contaminations?
So those, I'm gonna respond to that quickly and then move on, because we're trying to keep it to one question per person and we only have a few minutes left. AOCs with the AOCs with NASA and the Department of Energy, 2010 AOCs, those are still the same. So this only new agreement has been with Boeing. So those are still the same. And I want to thank you so much for hanging in there while your question was put in the chat and raising your hand. So really appreciate you joining us.
Thank you.
Now I'm, thanks, Julie. And now I'm going to invite Ruth Levanos, it looks like she's a Simi Valley Council member. So please, Ruth, go ahead and unmute your mic and ask your question.
Can you hear me?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, great. I have a statement and a question, and I just want to clarify with legal counsel for DTSC that we, the city of Simi Valley, do not make land use decisions over that land that is unincorporated land. But I can tell you that you.
I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Yeah, I want to clarify that the city of Simi Valley does not own that land, but our 127,000 residents are directly impacted by that, including myself. And I am a cancer survivor. My daughter has had thyroid issues, dental issues. We have had children, residents here that have died of cancer. They've had thyroid issues, dental issues. I'm also a teacher that lives in the area, in the Los Angeles County part of the area, where I just found out one of my colleagues who's 20 years younger than me also has cancer because he lived in West Hills. So when you talk about risk management, the only risk you're talking about is the risk to Boeing. You're not talking about risk to actual people. Ms. Corenstein's question was a valid one, because I know for a fact that the risk to our city isn't even considered, because it is associated, as your legal counsel has associated the risk with the city of Simi Valley. We're going to be the ones that are sued. Our taxpayers that are getting cancer are going to pay the bill for Boeing's lack of responsibility. And I want to know why you don't actually care about the risk to actual people, and who gave you the authority to give binding arbitration that gets Boeing out of the financial responsibility of people dying, of children dying of cancer. How can you say that it's based on science to clean up fewer chemicals? Because they're going to be exposed to it for less time? And the city of Simi Valley is going to be holding the bill, as well as the taxpayers, while we watch our children die? How can you agree to binding arbitration that removes accountability from the polluter? How can you not think of the risk to us, the people? I want to know. I want to know who's going to answer that question.
I would just like to make a clarification, and I apologize, council member. I was not aware that it's all unincorporated. So yes, it would be the county of Ventura that would regulate the land use there and not the city of Simi Valley. So my apologies there. I think the director wants to say something as well.
Thank you, Councilmember Luevanos. And you shared with us in an earlier conversation your experiences with cancer, how closely it's impacted your life. And many other people on this call have had to deal with cancer and live in, I do not live in the shadow of this hugely contaminated site. And so I can't pretend to know what that's like, to always wonder. And the best thing that we can do is to do the cleanup, and to do the cleanup, that we have to get the cleanup moving forward. And this does that, and the agreement does it, and it does it in a way that is sound, and we're confident that the levels of contaminant that remain in that soil will not be enough to cause health problems, public health problems, environmental health problems, stormwater runoff problems, groundwater problems. We will hold Boeing accountable to clean it up
Do you
to a
understand?
safe
I'm
level.
sorry, Meredith, but do you understand there's absolutely zero trust? There is zero trust because time and time again, DTSC, Boeing, NASA, and all the players, including the water board, the regional water board, have betrayed the people that live in this region. There is zero trust, and there's no reason to have trust because the risk you manage is that of corporations and not of the people. So there is zero trust here, and we're going to fight you tooth and nail for the full cleanup, the original agreement, to make sure that the people do not continue to die of cancer. I'm not going to have my daughter die of cancer because you want to list Boeing's liability when they made $42 billion in profit last year. They will not profit off of my cancer or my daughter's or anybody else's. I just want to make that clear to you so you're well aware that this is not done. We are not done, and this is not over.
Thank you. And I'm sure we'll continue to discuss this into the future.
Thank you, Director Williams, and thank you, Council Member. At this time, we're going to take one more question, and then we're going to wrap up our meeting for the evening. I know that we haven't been able to get to everyone, but those of you who have been engaged with us know that we're a highly responsive project team, and we'll make sure that if we haven't addressed your question, and you can't find the answer to it on our website, we'll make sure that you have a clear understanding. So I'm going to invite, it looks like Crystal, just Crystal, to ask your questions, and then we'll move on, close the meeting.
Hi. First, I want to thank you guys for coming on and speaking to us about all of this. I have to say that you guys have had extreme patience with everybody, and I appreciate that. My question has to do more with like the excavation and understanding that a little bit more. And I'm sorry if others already know this whole thing, but I think I am a little bit nervous about the dust monitoring and actually taking out dangerous materials more than leaving it in. So I just need to understand that piece a little bit more to make my to feel a little bit more comfortable.
Thanks, Crystal. Thanks for joining us. And we welcome all the questions that folks have. When it comes to, are you asking about monitoring during cleanup? We talked about
the dust monitoring, I guess, during cleanup and excavating in it so then the particles don't just like fly in the air and disperse amongst the environment or the community.
Yeah, so it looks like Steve, our branch chief, and Mindy are both prepared to address your question.
I can take this one. Thank you very much, Crystal. And certainly I understand why one would have concerns over the amount of dust that could be generated during excavation activities. As part of the work plans that are put together for the actual cleanup, in other words, when they start, digging up the dirt, there will be health and safety plans in there that address monitoring of both the workers who will be in very close proximity to where the soil is being dug up. And there are perimeter air monitoring stations that will also be monitored to ensure that, dust levels are kept within those acceptable and not sending anything off site at unacceptable risks. The most important ones are going to be obviously within the worker zone. Those are usually the most telling, and they're usually very tightly gridded, but we do have a network of air monitors around the site to as a secondary confirmation, ensure that materials and dust particulates are not leaving the site at elevated concentrations. Additionally, as assuming that trucking is the preferred alternative that gets carried forward, materials would be tarped as they're taken off site to prevent dust from migrating out of there. The other thing that's done is there are dust suppression measures such as water. There's other surfactants that can be added. There are ways to keep dust down and minimize it and prevent it under wind conditions from being transported outside of its immediate area. So that's a very good question, and I really appreciate you asking it. I hope that I've adequately addressed your question.
Yeah, I think you have. I mean, is there during like windier days, you guys still continue to move forward though? I know you have winds.
Well, I would anticipate there'll be some provisions in there that at some certain wind speed that work would have to cease, because if you get 60-mile-an-hour winds or 80-mile-an-hour winds blowing over ridgetop, it's pretty hard to control things. So the balancing act of controlling dust is also what is the wind speed, and those kind of things get worked out. But we will ensure that the dust monitoring plans will not allow dust to travel off site at levels that could cause any impacts to anyone. So yes, that's a good question, because that is an important thing to be considered in the plan. So thank you.
Gotcha. Thank you. And again, you got half the people upset because you're taking it out and half the people upset that you are not taking it out. And we appreciate you guys for this call.
I appreciate your input. Thank you.
Thanks, Crystal. And thank you for, recognizing the very widely varying perspectives in your community. I know we haven't been able, I'm going to ask Chin, will you please move to the next slide? So for those of you who joined tonight, we really appreciate it. And I'm sorry we couldn't get to every question. Hopefully some of you who haven't heard, who didn't get to ask your question personally, heard it asked by someone else. I want to also highlight our contact information for the project. Right now, you can reach out to Chen Xiao. He is handling public participation for the project. If you'll just say hello, Chen. Unmute.
Hi, good evening, everyone. My name is Chin Xiao from the Chatsworth Office of Public Engagement, and you can reach me at the numbers listed there, or feel free to email me. Thank you.
Thank you. And for members of the media, if you're here tonight, Allison Westcott, our Deputy Director for Public Affairs, is the contact for this project and the settlement agreement with Boeing matters. So her information is shared here as well. Will you move to the next slide, please? Thank you. At this time, I'd like to invite Director Williams to share any closing remarks before we say good evening.
Well, thank you all. We still even after a few hours, have 160 people online, which is really not a surprise at all. I haven't, been in my position so long as, the decades that some of you have been involved, but in that time, I have known people to dig into the details, to understand things at a technical level, to have very strong opinions, and to truly engage. And in this day in our world, people don't engage. And so it's important that you continue to do so. What I heard tonight was an expectation that you continue to be given the information you need to understand the decisions that DTSC is making, the science upon which we're basing those decisions, and that we provide that with clarity and consistency as we move forward. And we will certainly commit to doing that. And some good ideas came out tonight about how we could do that, and we'll discuss those and figure out how to continue, again, to provide information. I do ask that, of course, you're already on mailing lists, but please check that website over the coming weeks, because as we get additional external review, that will become available. We'll make as much information available, fact sheets, etc., based out of the conversation this evening. So I do want to thank all my team for preparing for this presentation, and we hope that you found it useful. Thank you, Marcia, for all your work to facilitate this discussion. And I know that you and Chin will continue to be available to pass the information on to our technical team and to continue the conversation we started tonight. I will just wrap up by saying we are confident that this settlement agreement will result in positive outcomes in terms of the safety of this site, in terms of advancing the cleanup, in terms of eliminating a myriad of possibility for delay. And we're proud of the agreement, and we will stand by it, and we will continue to explain to you just why we believe it's such a strong agreement. So with that, I say thank you and have a good evening and stay safe.
Thank you, Director Williams. Good night, everyone.